Are there questions, comments?
This is a question for Ethan. You mentioned pushing mobile web as opposed to doing apps, but I was curious on your thoughts on platform agnostic apps. I actually just launched one yesterday. And if you had any thoughts doing native builds through a platform agnostic program like PhoneGap or CenterTouch.
Well, this one. So, I mean, that's a platform agnostic development environment. That's not a platform agnostic distribution environment, because you're like with PhoneGap, and I've used PhoneGap before. I mean, you're doing one code base, which is actually HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but you are launching it on iPhone, iOS, BlackBerry. I mean, does anyone launch on BlackBerry anymore? Windows Phone. So I'm still, from a development perspective, I actually think that is a good thing, because it's using web technology to build mobile applications, but the end result is still a native application. And I'm going to, I'm absolutely guilty about that as well. I've built native apps. So I don't think it doesn't change anything. The IDE that you use doesn't in that case actually change anything, because you're still launching, native platform, non-agnostic applications.
Right, but keeping one code base.
Yeah, I mean that's purely for. The good thing about that is then you can have a mobile web site as well, because you're building in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So purely for kind of a logistical development perspective, yeah, that's great. And like I said, I've done it before as well. But for this argument of native versus web application, the end result is the same in those cases, because you're still launching, you're still building native apps.
Work with that you kind of push to maintain their own software.
Yeah.
Is it usually that they take an in-staff person who's updating their HTML or keeping it relevant, or is it partnering with companies or other institutions who have resources?
All of the above. I like to encourage institutions to have the human resources in-house as well. And again, really expensive. This is not a do this or you'll be irrelevant. But again, if you want to control the software in-house, you want to have the person in-house as well. I'll keep this.
We're sitting in training institutions, and you work in one, and you're asking for a mindset, a changed mindset between proprietary and openness. Would you talk a little about how you changed the training to get the changed mindset?
So that specifically the kinds of training? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, we're training curators and scholars and researchers, and it's been a very long tradition that one's expertise is one's stock and trade, one's hard-won, hard-fought-for piece of the universe. And now you're asking us to make it, to share it, and I think that there's a place that needs to happen which helps in that transition.
I think that, and you're absolutely right, and that is certainly not unique to the sort of the museum. The scholarly world is. Our identity is built on our ideas, and we'll fight with people to the death to protect our identities. Ironic, that's not particularly scholarly. But I think that there's two things that I'd respond. One is get them early, and so you start to instill these kinds of values very, very early on, undergraduates, certainly graduate students as well. But also work hard to show value. Work hard to the professionals and the practitioners who are already out sort of in the field and in positions of power, work hard to, as opposed to, you should do this because it's good. Why is it good? You know, how is it going to benefit the institution? How is it going to benefit the mission of the institution, the mission of the scholar? The evangelist, again, you know, shouldn't be tone deaf at all to the mission and the sort of the professional goals of that institution. And that discussion that happens, and it absolutely has to be a discussion that happens, not a, like I said, you know, do this because it's good. Needs to include an awareness of that institution, that domain, that individual as well.
So, can you hear me? So I had a question for Gunalan, and I couldn't help but detect in many of the descriptions of the installations and pieces that you worked with that there was not just a disruption of sort of traditional museum business as usual, but this is also somehow an intended effect. And I guess I'm wondering if you could say more about how this might inform some of the examples where I sort of implicitly understood that media art often has to be segregated from what you're calling the white box. Mm-hmm. Is this, you know, necessary? I'm also wondering what happens if there's a greater infiltration of media arts into more traditional spaces. And one of the things that comes to mind here, I don't know if you know the work of Charlotte Plonk, but she's a historian of gallery space, and she is somewhat concerned about what happens when the black box and the white box mix, along the lines of what maybe happens to some of the social potential of the traditional museum. And she's also mindful that that potential has not necessarily also been reached in every case. But I guess there are several issues that come with this idea of disruption. I wonder if you could say more about that.
I think that disruption is, I don't think, at least in my Kyoto projects, disruption is not the intended effect. It is one of the outcomes, usually unintended, that it disrupts the economy that organizes space and programming within museum settings. But I think that interestingly, in the history of media arts development, you will see that more and more these art forms are finding their own spaces. They are practically not being shown in museums. They are not shown in major art biennials also. You know, because most biennial curators have a bias that sometimes precludes the possibility of showcasing media artworks. So what's been happening is that there's this parallel track that they have been taking. So media arts has its own venues. For a long time, one of the best suited venues for media artworks was the Kajasma Museum in Helsinki. It's an amazing space, and it was already equipped in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was already equipped well enough to take on some major exhibitions. The Banff Center was another art space, not necessarily a museum space that took on some of these things. The Walker Art Center, again, not a museum, but an art space that equipped itself for some of these things, but slowly decided to not do it anymore. So that's why I started off by saying that part of what my talk was about, and my intent is that we embrace the larger challenges of what technology represents in museums, not just in dissemination and storing and archiving, but also recognize that it's changing the way, the kinds of exhibits we are creating, the kinds of works that we are showing, the kinds of works that are being made out there, and that surely needs a different kind of space, a different kind of thinking about what these spaces should be and how they should be presenting works. So this parallel track that media arts and contemporary artworks or modern artworks, finding different spaces, different venues, different events, is probably going to continue for a while, simply because many art institutions, traditional art institutions are, as you rightly pointed out, still struggling to invest in new infrastructure. Any kind of undertaking is huge, especially if you're talking about technological infrastructure. And it's infrastructure that you need to maintain, it's infrastructure you need to train people in. But it's something that we need to take into account if we are going to develop a different model of how the museums would invent themselves or reinvent themselves for the future. If we are losing museum audiences, it's got to do with the fact that our exhibits are not exactly, creating the kinds of compelling experiences that people are looking for. There are many more competing things in the attention-driven economy that we are living in. So I think that it's I'm hopeful that it would change, but I don't see the black box becoming integrated into the white cube. It's nice to think about it as a way of disrupting and changing things, but it's not likely to. I'm hopeful, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
This is a question for Ethan, question of strategy. With regards to scholars publishing on the open web, how does one deal with situations where one is compelled to publish in closed contexts?
I missed a little bit of your audio cutout.
Oh, sorry. Basically, I was just asking, there are many disciplines in which the referee journals in which we publish are closed.
Yes.
So in terms of strategies, how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I kind of purposefully avoided talking about publication because it's and it easily, I mean, it fits under this umbrella, but mostly because it's such a Pandora's box and it's such its own topic. But in terms of strategies is, and oftentimes this is well out of the control of the individual scholar, right? And it's also very sort of disciplinary based, where there may be, open access journals in some disciplines that are well respected. I mean, PLOS is one of them, right? Extremely well respected. But there may be other disciplines where those simply do not exist. So there's a couple of strategies, and also these strategies are dependent on the academic capital that the individual has, and also the seniority in many cases. And I mean, junior scholars sometimes don't have, nor should they, make this, the platform to die upon. And I think that, given that, I think that sort of choose, all things being equal, choose the open access version, and be prepared as a scholar to justify why you did that, be able to articulate why you did that. Second thing is, within your discipline, and again, senior scholars are much more, this is more of a, appropriate for them, is advocate for the acceptability of publication within that. Another strategy is, when you are, negotiating, you're about to sign that the author agreement, that copyright agreement. One, you can ask for to include a SPARC addendum. The SPARC addendum, which essentially allows you to maintain copyright and also allows you to self-archive. And a lot of times, journals or publication platforms that are not outwardly open access will just kind of go, okay, sure. I've had that happen a bunch of times where I was like, oh, this is going to be a fight. This is going to be a fight, and then they just kind of went, all right. So it was an easy win, and you're not disrupting their their revenue source if you're self-archiving, or you can sort of advocate with the editor for, well, can I maintain the copyright, or can we adjust this copyright? So I mean, there's a variety of kind of strategies that you can use. None of them are certainly appropriate for all scholars. None of them are comfortable for all scholars, and it depends across the discipline.
A question to both speakers, but both don't have to answer here. Aren't we really dancing around the issue of what is valued in a museum? By changing the forms in which information and experiences are presented, we're basically attacking, and I say that in a good form, or challenging the power structure, the voice of the curator, the voice of the authority, and saying that this is a polyphonic universe for what is legitimate. And that as museums managers and curators, what's perhaps most important out of this is to be looking at this for what truly is valued as we do these massive data dumps or ephemeral displays that are in some senses no more ephemeral than a classic, what I will call bricks and mortar painting exhibit. They go back into storage. The other ones electronically go away. Conceptually, to me, these are no different. But it's what's the value underneath here that we're providing for society? And it seems to me that we're undergoing a paradigm shift we don't understand, that many find challenging, and this is what's so embracing about putting the data out, messy as it is, or cleaned up or not. If we're opening ourselves to the voices of others to say what is truly legitimate to a broader audience.
Yes.
I agree with you. Yeah. It is a bad if you ask
We
me.
have to change. So I guess my question is, how do we change?
I think that some of us talked about training, some of us talked about embracing different ideals and like openness and acknowledging that the kinds of reception that we are used to in the museum world perhaps would not work in the long run, and we need to invent different ways of doing this. We need to respond to the new technologies that are available to people to grab attention away, and I think we need to do a whole range of things in education, in institutional structures, value shifting in values, and it can only succeed if it's happening in multiple levels.
What he said.
So are the dinosaurs going to die of old age, or is this the meteor that's going to kill them all?
Is that metaphor? With that happy note, please join me in thanking our speakers once again.